Reading 81 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Maurice, Nicoll, Volume 2. Quaramid Ugle, June 23, 1945. Commentary on Observing I. On seeing contradictions in ourselves. In these commentaries that have been written recently about the dark or unconscious or unacknowledged sides of us, which result in our living always in the little parts of ourselves, not remembering the rest of ourselves at different moments. We spoke of the necessity of increasing consciousness so that it begins to embrace the whole circle of human life. For that reason, it was once said in the early teaching that we must get to know every I in us, and it was added that why we are all wrong and cannot grow further is because we are conscious of one I at a time, which we take as our consciousness, as ourselves. Therefore, we see no contradictions in ourselves and live, so to speak, always in a very small place at a time. As work memory is increased through self-observation, we begin to distrust the particular I we happen to be in at the moment, that particular moment of time. When I say that we do not trust it, I mean that we do not quite believe what it is saying, what it is thinking, what it is feeling just at that moment. If we do not begin to understand this, any I that happens to be at the moment uppermost in us, any I that we take as ourselves at that moment, and which says and does and promises things for a very short time, later we know nothing about. In other words, we have to become far more conscious of this rotation of I's in us so that we can remember what one I said and also what another I said. Otherwise, we have no distinct being, which means that our being is constantly shifting, being controlled by temporary I's of the moment. Now, what is that thing in us that can stand higher than ordinary I's? And why is it said so much in the work that we must observe our different I's? The answer is that we have observing I in us if we can only use it, and it can have a memory of its own because it stands outside the machinery of these turning I's and views them, as it were, in a detached way, and makes in itself its own memory of these different I's that it has observed. And this memory is called work memory. You must understand that each I mechanically getting up and having charge for the moment has its own memory, but observing I has a quite different quality of memory. Now I wish to speak to you about narrowness of outlook. We may have a certain vague memory of having acted in one way and then acted in a contrary way. We are often uneasy, and I do not like any man or woman who is not a little uneasy about himself or herself. Only when you have a vague uneasiness about your own contradictions and things which you find incompatible with other things in yourself, you must realize that you have a certain kind of observation, a certain kind of vague consciousness of what your own life is like, but that you are identified with it and judge yourself in consequence according to your upbringing. Now the point about observing I, established by the influence of the work and the acceptance and valuation of it, is that it is something that can observe you uncritically, that is, without identifying. It observes you impersonally. It observes your personality impersonally, and it remembers what it has observed uncritically, impersonally. Personality is composed of different I's and is, as it were, turning like a wheel so that at one moment one I is uppermost and in charge, and at another moment another is uppermost and in charge. We have a dim recollection of this already, but we always take sides in regard to this dim observation of ourselves. But the establishment of the observing I in the work sense is the establishment in you of a level of consciousness above these different ever-changing eyes. The observing eye, in the sense of the work, does not take sides with anything. It merely records what you are doing, what you are saying, at different moments, through the action of different eyes, and does not say that this is better or this is worse. Observing eye is not shocked by anything. It is not a kind of grandmama or grandpapa in you, but it is quite pure and simple. And Mr. Ouspensky used often to compare it with a camera that simply photographs your psychological state at each moment. He said, observing eye must stand outside the personality, stand outside this cage of eyes, this zoological garden of eyes that are constantly taking charge in a kind of rotation and calling themselves I, that is you. The establishment of this observing eye, he used to point out, is something that is very difficult because such observation, as we have ordinarily in social intercourse, is based really on one eye, a little bit observing another eye, and criticizing it, and finding fault with it. The observing eye in the work sense stands outside all these eyes that take charge of us at each moment. It is therefore on a level above personality, and as you know, this observing eye that the work emphasizes so much, and about which it is so constantly said that it must be uncritical and have no acquired moral values, is the most important thing to establish in ourselves if we want to change. This observing eye that the work speaks of is under the influence of the work itself. It comes under the influence of the work later on. But at first, our task is to establish an impersonal, uncritical observation of ourselves. What does uncritical mean? It means that if you observe something in yourself, you do not criticize it as good or bad. You simply see that you, the machine of yourself, the acquired eyes in you, are doing this or that at the particular moment. They are talking in this way. They are talking in that way. They are feeling this. They are feeling that. No single I in your personality will ever include the whole of yourself in its consciousness. But the real observing eye will include the whole of your life eventually. It will become conscious of all sides of yourself. It will have its own uncritical, gentle memory of all the different sides of you. Certain things in your life are incompatible with other things, and so you feel conflict and distress. For instance, to a person with a very narrow outlook, many things become incompatible as a result of this very narrow outlook. A man thinks things are evil owing to a very narrow outlook. Now suppose this person becomes broader-minded. Many things that were formerly incompatible begin to take their place and no longer seem incompatible. But for observing eye, nothing is incompatible because nothing is criticized. So we might say, in a rather too small way, that observing eye is very broad-minded. As you know, lots of people are sure of many things that they do not possess. I fancy all of you think you are very broad-minded, and I always dislike it when I am told that I have to meet a person who is broad-minded. I may remind you that this is no sort of description to give me of a person who wants to come into this work. Your so-called broad-minded person, yourself, is extremely narrow-minded. What does broad-minded mean? It is not a work expression. Do you think that this observing eye, when it is once established and observes and records every side of yourself, is broad-minded? Yes, of course it is. Unless you come into this relationship of real observing eye, which is so uncritical, you will not be able to shift yourself from where you are, because you will be always in the turning wheel of different and contradictory eyes that you try vaguely, with a kind of dim consciousness, to reconcile with one another. You have to accept the whole of your life, all the side that is dark to you at the moment, all that side that is unconscious to you at the instant, the very narrow outlook, which of course we all deny having, as the result of your little being, your small, tedious little being, always quarreling and objecting and finding fault at every moment. Now, the only cure for this is to broaden your being, and that means to become more conscious of the whole of your being, all these eyes in you, and to be able to endure the contradictions of all of them. All this is only possible by establishing this uncritical and sincere observing eye. Through its memory, through a right relationship to it, you will find that you begin to change in your whole picture of yourself, in your whole idea of yourself, because you must remember that when you die, all your life appears to you with all its contradictions, because it is yourself. It is sometimes said that people see their whole lives when drowning or something like that, and this is not nonsense. But what we have to do is to try to see all round ourselves in this life before we die. Then certainly we will no longer have the same opinion of ourselves, the same prejudices, the same buffers. But this is the work of observing eye. This is what observing eye must fulfill in ourselves, little by little. When you have no observing eye, when you have no power of separating from what life has made you, when you take yourself for granted, then you must remember that you have a very small bank balance and are very quickly overdrawn. Now, what does this mean? To have a very small bank balance? Of course, it has nothing to do with money or your literal bank. It refers to your capacity for bearing things without being identified. Suppose you have a very high opinion of yourself. Then your bank balance is very quickly overdrawn. Let me try to explain this to some people who cannot understand about psychological ideas, psychological meaning. If you have a very great opinion of yourself, you'll be easily offended, easily irritated, easily upset. Therefore, your bank balance will be very quickly overdrawn. That is, you will soon feel negative, feel offended. Now, you should not lay up treasure in any ordinary mechanical bank. We are told to lay up treasure in heaven, that is, on a higher level. If you are insupportably full of your own excellence and merit, are you laying up treasure in heaven? No, you are simply a person who is going to be very easily offended, insulted, very soon overdrawn on his or her bank. We have to acknowledge and accept all sides of ourselves, because only through the acknowledgement, the acceptance, the consciousness of all sides of ourselves can we advance at all. This is exactly what broadens our being. Under the influence of the memory of observing eye, under the influence of this uncritical self-observation, we begin to feel loosened from all sorts of fantastic ideas of ourselves. We begin to be loosened from all sorts of fantastic attributions to ourselves of virtues and merit that we do not possess at all. We certainly then become little children. We certainly then begin to understand what the opening words of the Sermon on the Mount mean. We certainly then cease to be big, overswelling with some small pride or vanity. We begin to get an entirely new sense of ourselves, an entirely new feeling, entirely new thoughts. We cease to be the person we have imagined ourselves to be all through our lives. For this, you must have a different kind of self-knowledge. Your whole groundwork becomes different. Through the influence of observing eye, you will be rescued from many dangers. What is our greatest danger as we get older? Our greatest danger is to crystallize out into our idea of ourselves. After a time, things begin to become rather fixed in us. We begin to believe our imagination of ourselves, of the kind of people we are, what good and kind creatures we are. But this uncritical observing eye if it is supported properly by the constant feeling and valuation of the work, begins to prevent us from this early crystallization into a certain definite kind of person, which is quite false. If we can give value to the work, then we can give value to what observing eye notices about ourselves, and then we shall not be in such great danger of crystallizing out into what we imagine ourselves to be, into some definite opinion of ourselves, into our own excellence, our own extraordinary merit, our own unexplained values. We are all such tiny and unpleasant creatures that it takes a great deal of self-observation to observe that we are really quite ridiculous in our vanity, in our pride. I rather fancy that some people always think that they have a marvelous gift to bestow upon other people. But what is this precious gift that people want to bestow on others? Have you asked yourselves individually what you have in yourselves worthwhile for anyone else to accept? I think after a time in the work, people become more simple in this way. I think after a time in the work, people become more simple in this way. And why is this so? Because they really begin to observe themselves. Instead of imagining that they are what they believe, they begin to see that the gulf between what they imagine themselves to have been and what they are is very wide. When this happens through the constant, uncritical influence of observing eye, the whole relationship to oneself begins to change. All that you have hitherto based your value on, all your different forms of feeling superior to others, all this begins to be dissolved. You no longer build yourself up on false personality that is your most dangerous enemy and is composed entirely of imagination. Of course, this cannot be done artificially by mock humility, than which I fancy nothing is worse. You can go about looking down your nose while inside you are full of hissing serpents. No, I am not speaking of any false humility. What I am speaking about is what the work speaks about, namely, that if observing eye is established in you, and you really begin to observe yourself, and how you speak, and how you feel, and how you think, and how contradictory the whole thing is, then you will have a very beautiful experience, because you will no longer have to keep up the invented person to whom you are a slave. Now this can only happen in the work because the work must hold you at certain moments and give you strength. No one is allowed in the work, no one is allowed by the work to observe themselves further than they can bear. You may be quite sure that in the atmosphere of the work, no one will suffer wrongly. A great many have not even begun to observe themselves, and the reason is that they cannot do it. They cannot get beyond their idea of themselves, or rather, they cannot get under their imagination of themselves. Instantly, they begin to feel they are no good, of no importance. They suffocate. And yet, I must remind you again of what we were told when we went to the French Institute, that, quote, personality has scarcely any right to exist here, end quote. And I will also remind you at the end of this paper that unless a man begins to realize his own nothingness, he can get nowhere. If a man or a woman begins to see through his or herself, through all their lies and their inventions of themselves, and if they do it in the atmosphere of the work, feeling that the work will lead them to a new level of being, they are safe, and they will undergo little by little a perfectly definite and real transformation of themselves. But if they try to do this work without the influence of the work behind them, they will get nowhere, and all their observation will be useless and simply lead to quarrels, arguments, and negative emotion. We are all trying to study something that is very big, and we must realize that we are very small.